Okay, here we go. Nice. Thank you. Missing your dance. I'm sure that some other people maybe may have the same feelings. Okay, so good morning, Timothy, once again. Thank you very much for being with us. It is great to have you
Good morning,
online
Maya. Good
again.
morning, everybody.
Where are you today? Where are you?
So
Where are you reporting from?
today I am in Katsuyama. I sailed to Misaki yesterday on the tip of the Yokohama Peninsula. But because of gale force winds predicted for today, I came back so that I could have the room without the possibility of sinking.
Well, that's good to know. I believe that we're going to have, yes, we're going to have a great briefing today again. To everybody who is on Clubhouse, has joined us again, thank you. And I'm not going to keep you waiting anymore. You already know Timothy Langley. He's the CEO of Langley Esquire, a consultancy firm here in Tokyo. And well, Timothy, let's start.
Thank you very much, Maya, and good morning, everybody. Today is December 4th, and this is our 95th episode, Maya. Did you realize that? We've been doing this solidly for 95 weeks. That's pretty
95
amazing.
weeks, yes.
When we first started this, we weren't sure if Japanese politics was going to be rich enough or vibrant enough for us to be reporting on it every week. And Maya, this has just been an incredible revelation to me that the more we study it and the more the questions and the audience grows, the richer the texture of what's going on in Japanese politics. And boy, with this prime minister, it just hasn't stopped since the election of the half of the upper house about 4 months ago. So he's really dealing with a lot of different issues. The diet is in session. It is supposed to end on December 10th. There's no way it's going to end. They are going to extend it probably for another 10 days in order to get the bills done. The reason for this is because the opposition has been fighting against the prime minister and insisting on explanations of the unification church and inflation and the yen depreciation and all of these things, and not sitting with the prime minister to talk about bills that need to be, there was 60 bills that were proposed for this extraordinary diet session. And instead of talking about that, the opposition has said, we're not going to be talking with you until we have an explanation on this. So if you're watching TV, even if you're not really highly conversant in Japanese, you'll be noticing that the prime minister and the cabinet and many of the opposition parties are in this pretty opulent room. This is the budget committee hearing room. It is one of the rooms where committees are held. It's the largest committee room in the parliament. And they meet there to discuss bills, the creation of bills, before they are actually proposed to the Diet for a vote. So all of these discussions that are going on that you're watching on TV, where the opposition party stands up and they have charts behind them, and then they're asking very politely but very pointed questions to the prime minister and members of his cabinet, an explanation of why you did this and what happened with this and why is this money being spent. These deliberations are all taken into consideration for the government, the cabinet typically, to form a bill for proposal to the Diet. And that process occurs fairly frequently, but it will be at a pitch level now, as today's the 4th, tomorrow's the 5th, 5 days left in this Diet session. There's a lot of voting that's going on. They have done some votes. They have passed some bills. They passed in the lower house the supplemental budget, 29 trillion yen for a supplemental budget for this year up until March of next year, 2023. 29 trillion is a tremendous amount of money. That's 214 billion US dollars worth of spending that's going into keeping prices down, paying for fuel, paying for supplementing fuel costs, and giving people money so that they can survive through the winter. So this is a tremendous amount of money. It passed the lower house. It's in the upper house right now. Typically what happens is a bill that goes to that is passed through the lower house and goes to the upper house. If it's not passed, it comes back to the lower house, and the lower house reasserts its proposal. And so basically the upper house is kind of given the finger, we passed a bill, you didn't like it, but we're going to pass it again. That's the process. But more likely than not, the upper house will pass it, and then it will be the law, and the money will be released. But the prime minister has got other issues that he's confronting, and I'd like to brief you on those, to give you a picture and a kind of a snapshot of what he is confronting. So just to tee that up, in 5 days' time, this diet will close. This is the 210th diet. When it closes up, the new diet will start sometime in January. The Constitution dictates that it start sometime in January. So before January 31st, that session needs to start. So between the end of this diet, there is a bit of time where things can happen. And a lot of people are clamoring for these things to happen. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. But first, let's talk about what's going on with the prime minister. So as you might recall, he went on an 8-day visit to Cambodia and Indonesia to attend ASEAN and the G20. He really made a lot of headway there. But unfortunately, his messaging and his attempt to identify himself as the spokesman for denuclearization and also a free and open Asia Pacific really didn't hit the marks, not only for dynamic reasons. I mean, people understand that he's suffering. He had 2 ministers that had resigned or were forced to resign. He had one who was kind of waiting on tenterhooks while the prime minister was away. And since that time, he's had 3 ministers ejected from his cabinet. That hasn't happened in 8 years that that many cabinet ministers have departed. So it's a signal for what his longevity looks like and the health of his administration. And world leaders look at that and they kind of calibrate it. So there were a couple of meetings that didn't go as fruitfully as he had hoped. And then his policy speech was marred by the launch by North Korea of an ICBM, a really big one, not with multiple warheads, but with enough power and enough thrust going through an arch that telegraphed to everybody that the United States, the entire continental United States, is within reach of the new ICBM that North Korea has launched. So they had emergency meetings as a result of that, and the prime minister's speech kind of fell on somewhat deaf ears. In addition to that, he's got the Unification Church. So the bill on Unification Church has been hotly debated. It's been hotly debated for a couple of reasons. Number one, the opposition loves to have an issue that they can attack the LDP on, and this one is really rich. The largest faction within the LDP is the Abe faction, the former Abe faction. It's still called the Abe faction, Seiwakai. And it looks like the Unification Church, of all of the maybe 180 members of the parliament who have, somewhat deep ties with the Unification Church, deep being a relative term, but enough to blemish them. Of those members, the vast majority are in the Seiwakai, in the Abe faction. So this is a potent tool for the opposition party. But not only that, the other thing is that for the population, they are really angered at this. And a former prime minister was assassinated as a consequence of this. And this has been happening right under our noses. We have the Sokagakai, which is a religious organization, somewhat similar in terms of structure to the Unification Church. And it started its political arm which eventually grew into a political party, which is Komeito today, who is the coalition partner to Jiminto. So the Unification Church saw this and thought, this is the way to go. We need to ingratiate ourselves to the political world. We need to be able to form laws, or at least influence the creation of laws, so that we benefit from that, and that we too, like Soka Gakkai, can emerge as a political force in this country. So that was the dream. That was why there was so much money that was involved, and their collection of money by selling promises of eternal salvation. If you buy this vase, or if you sign over your inheritance to us, everybody in your family will have eternal salvation. That kind of thing. These were hotly debated in the Diet. Soka Gakkai, as the coalition party, is telling the LDP, I know people are telling you to hammer the Unification Church, but back off a little bit, because a lot of what we're talking about resembles what we do and what we have been doing. And so the somewhat watered down version of what the proposal is to address the Unification Church has enraged the opposition party. So the issues on mind control, how somebody in a position of power can assert some influence over somebody who is suffering. They've had a divorce, a death in the family, and they're lonely and they're looking for something to belong to. That has been really played to the hilt. So one of the discussions that took a lot of time this last week in deliberations was the ability of people to influence that. It was called some sort of form of mind control. That had to be walked back because the definitions were very unspecific and could be manipulated in a lot of different ways. But they finally came up with language that apparently passed the smell test with most people. And that unification bill, it does not outlaw the Unification Church. Many people were asking that they be outlawed, that they lose their tax status, that they be punished, that people can sue them. So they have different stipulations in the bill that is being proposed now. It will go to the Diet before the Diet closes, and more than likely pass. But it has several components to it. For example, if you have given your family inheritance to the church, and this goes back a couple of years now, since this has been revealed, you can claim back, you can claw that back. For many people, that is just not enough. We have been damaged. The entire family's been damaged. We want reparations. We want damages, not only the repatriation of the money that our grandfather, gave to the church, and you can have your stinking statue back, but we want damages too for the evilness that was practiced on us. So there's a lot of tension there, and it has pulled down the prime minister, because other things he wants to talk about. He wants to talk about, the supplemental budget, about defense spending, about new capitalism, and he hasn't been able to get that kind of traction that's going to help promote him. He came back from his overseas trip hoping that he's going to have a little bit of wind in his sails, because that's typically what happens when you're a little bit battered at home. As you go overseas, you generate a little bit of credibility from there. People on the home front read about how you're having dinner and making speeches, and people are listening to you in a foreign country, and it does embellish your style, your reputation. And coming back, it really didn't. He was hammered. He had to fire his third cabinet minister the day that he returned on Saturday, as soon as he came back from his trip. So there's another cabinet minister that's also under fire. Something like this happens, and in light of that, his approval rating is at 31%, 29%, depending on who you're talking about. That is really the death zone for prime ministers. Not only is he suffering in those ratings, but having 3, 4 cabinet ministers resigned and replaced. 2 of them were in his political faction, in fact. One of them was criticized for political funding and his use of receipts, and somewhat suspiciously, 2 days later, it was leaked, the prime minister's receipts for his election campaigning. So it looks like a little bit of maybe revenge, or, if, be careful what you're treading on here, Mr. Prime Minister, because the same can be said of you. So that kind of thing is going on. So he's hampered not only is he hampered by his personality by being not very aggressive and moving the ball forward, Kentochu, he's thinking about things. He does that a lot, and it does upset a lot of people in his party. But the approval rating is really not a good issue, and it does suggest that it's time to change horses. And so we can talk a little bit about that, but let's talk about a couple of the other issues that he's talking about in this diet session. He has instructed the cabinet and the ministers to increase the defense budget from 1% to 2%. We've been talking about this for the last 6 months, but now he's actually instructed them. He's instructed the finance ministry to come up with the money to fund that over the next 5 years. That is going to be an increase of 100% of what they're spending now, 2% of GDP. This is a tremendous amount of money. He's getting criticism there because he's talking about the purpose of increasing the budget without going into the specifics. So let's just increase it without actually having, usually it's the other way around. We need these components, we need these capabilities. So let's calculate what that's going to be and then propose a number to the parliament. He's not doing it that way. The NATO members contribute 2% of their GDP to the national defense. And so he's ascribed to that, and that's what he's pushing. There's another kind of scenario going on in the background that has not been quite revealed to us yet, but I think it's something about having a more unitary, not just NATO, because Japan does not belong in NATO, but to subscribe to that and to pay that amount of money. Probably the Quad is a part of that. This 2+2 scenario, you might remember that the Prime Minister has promoted, and the United States has endorsed it. They've actually started this 2+2, which is the foreign minister and the defense minister of various states get together. It's kind of an elevated shuttle diplomacy. It's been going on now ever since the Quad was kind of suggested, even before Quad was launched. But they're doing this more and more aggressively now. Just this week coming up, there will be a 2+2 with Australia. So there will be a lot going on in the news with Australia, the defense minister there and their foreign minister meeting with Japan's defense minister and foreign minister. This is when the Diet is getting ready to wrap things up, and probably there will be controversy here. The Prime Minister will probably go on TV and say it's imperative that we extend this diet. So an extraordinary diet session is going to be extended a further day, 5 days or 6 days, whatever he's going to say, in order to pass these bills. So defense spending is not really a bill that is being considered. It is a policy that he is pursuing, and it will be endorsed by the cabinet. Excuse me. But one of the qualifications for this is an issue that's under a lot of discussion here, and it's a counterstrike capability of Japan. A counterstrike capability, many people are saying it really is not, it's not within the bounds of the Japanese constitution, which is the Japanese country will never have offensive capabilities. So when somebody hits you with a weapon and you counterstrike them, that is not defensive. That could be interpreted as offensive, but it could be interpreted as defensive too, because you don't want to be hit again. So they've debated this very hotly, and counterstrike is probably one of the reasons why they need to go from 1% to 2%, because it's very expensive. They've just decided that they're going to purchase at least 500 Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States to bolster the defense capabilities. And these cruise missiles are designed to be a kind of a protective shield to shoot down other missiles. They're very expensive, highly secretive, so they have to travel with their own secret codes and that sort of thing. The United States is not very open to sharing these kinds of capabilities. But the discussion now is that probably some of these will be located in Japan. Some of them will be put on Japanese destroyers and within Japanese submarines too. So this is a really big deal, very expensive. So it begins to explain why Japan needs to expand their defense spending and why the 2+2 is going on at such a feverish pace. So the Japanese prime minister is confronted by wanting to do this, and his political faction, the Kishida faction, has been rather pacifist in the past. They've been counterbalanced by the Abe faction, which is much more militaristic and more defense spending and more aggressive in tone. Since the Abe faction still is the largest political faction, 98 members, many have interpreted the prime minister's approach on defense spending as a way of ingratiating himself more to the Abe faction. He needs the Abe faction. If the prime minister, Mr. Abe, was alive today, there's a lot of things that just would not have happened because of his power and the weight of his faction, and just the fact that he by himself is, as probably more powerful than even the prime minister. There were many instances when the prime minister himself, in needing to speak with Abe, would actually go to visit Mr. Abe rather than to call Mr. Abe and please come see me in the prime minister's residence. So that's very telling too. So the defense spending, even within the LDP, has some opposition. It has some great proponents, and it's a very delicate balancing act, but the prime minister is going forward with that 2%. Let's bolster our defenses, and perhaps before even changing the Constitution, let's begin working at the edges there, where defense kind of means offense, and counter-strike capability. It's not first strike, so there was a lot of discussion in the Diet about that. I'm sorry if I'm getting a little bit too wound up about the defense capabilities, but eventually there will be a bill that will be proposed, and you'll really see, how strong the prime minister is. The prime minister was also visited by the president of Mongolia this last week. So that's interesting because Mongolia has diplomatic relations with North Korea, and the discussions that they had this last week, as reported, was that Mongolia needs to exercise a little bit of diplomatic weight on their North Korean neighbors to get them to back off on all of these tests. So the next shoe to fall is probably this underground nuclear test, the 7th, to kind of prove the concept of the miniaturization of nuclear devices in North Korea. So this is a very worrying thing. The USS Ronald Reagan, which is a aircraft carrier fleet, they have said it will be stationed in the Japan Sea should that test occur. Not only that, but the United States and Japan and several other countries have also ratcheted up their sanctions against North Korea, freezing assets of countries, of companies and individuals. So that was just announced this last week, hoping that our dear leader in North Korea will take the message and begin a diplomatic approach rather than the saber-rattling approach that he seems to favor. It's been almost a month since that last launch, so it could be that before the year is out, there might be another show of force. People are bracing for that. In many of the southern islands of Japan, Yonaguni and Okinawa and Ishigaki, these are now receiving much more bolstered defense capabilities. They're stationing guidance rockets and protective shields for protection. They're training the residents. They're building shelters, but they're also massively increasing the number of Japanese self-defense forces there. Okinawa is receiving a full general now. It's not a brigadier, it's a full general who will be stationed now in Japan, division level. So ground self-defense forces of the infantry type are being now stationed in Okinawa. And so this is a pretty big deal as well. Korea relations continue to be a really thorny issue. It's important for Japan. It's important for the United States. That this facilitation between South Korea and Japan be resolved. they have been making good progress there. I think the issue with the assets that have been seized for the two Japanese companies to pay reparations will likely be resolved, but it's almost like, two steps forward, one step back. It has now become apparent that South Korean opposition has insisted that UNESCO force the Japanese to be a little bit more descriptive about these World Heritage sites. In Sado Island, there's a gold mine there, and then there's an island, a kind of a concrete island called Battleship Island. It's in Hashima Island. Many of you might have seen it on YouTube or even visited. It is actually a coal mine that goes deep underground and extracts coal from, wow, very far away from where the opening in the sea is. So during the colonial period, the Japanese brought in many Korean laborers there and also to the gold mine. And the South Koreans are insisting, when you made this bid for UNESCO heritage um, authorization, you weren't as descriptive about how this facility was built and what the Korean laborers did, and many of them were like slave laborers, and you need to be a little bit more descriptive about that. So although we make progress on some areas, there's other opposition there. And I think a reasonable person could say, it is fair for all of those people that suffered from that and during the colonial period to just talk about it, just fess it up. And I think the Japanese are very, very reluctant to do that because it opens up a real can of worms. So there might be progress on that. There might not be progress on that. But it's one of those thorns in the side of developing better South Korea and Japan relationships, which are so very important. The supplemental budget was passed this last week. It went through the lower house and into the upper house, 214 billion US dollars to get us to April of this next year. So that is a tremendous amount of money. One of the things that the government and even Mr. Kishida, his pet project is, this new capitalism that will be growing tenfold in the next 5 years. He is devoting $72 billion. That's a lot of money. What is it? 10 trillion yen over the next 5 years to bolster, to jumpstart the startup community here in Japan. That is just a tremendous amount of money. You wonder what they're going to be doing and how this is going to benefit the population at large. So the Prime Minister did go into that in a little bit more detail. He has a council on revitalizing the capitalism. He calls it the Council on the New Form of Capitalism Realization. He is the chairman of that, so it is important to him. He's talked about wealth redistribution. He's talked about bringing up the upper class, the lower class into the middle class, raising wages, and then redistributing wealth so that the Japanese economy has a kind of a new takeoff. He's been short on details, and what he's revealed to us this last week is not only this number of the amount of money that he's going to be devoting over the next 5 years, some of the components of that, for example, sending 1,000 eager Japanese into Silicon Valley, into the United States, into these hotbeds, maybe even Israel too, to study how this ecosystem emerged, what kind of personalities are there, how it might be replicated in the United States. I think it's a great idea. It's kind of like the Abe Fellowship or some of the programs that the Japanese have sponsored, the Fulbright, that sort of thing, where people would come to Japan, people would go to the United States, they would cross-fertilize, and then they would become eventually the leaders of what was going on in those respective countries later in their careers. So this is probably a good idea. It's an awful lot of money. You wonder how they can supplement that. Koike, we reported last week, is hot on this issue too, and she is devoting a lot of money to building an incubator site here in Tokyo, and also devoting money to this strategy of generating tenfold the number of companies that are being established in the hopes that of the 12 unicorns that Japan has, that also increases, tenfold. That's a big trick, but they're putting a lot of money into it, like in many things Japan does. For example, Cool Japan, or a lot of other initiatives. It's just not enough. It's just a little bit, just not enough to bring it over the edge, and so these initiatives sometimes falter and fail as a consequence of that. Who knows what's going to happen with this new capitalism and the startup push? But it is getting a lot of press. The how people participate in that will become a little bit more evident as we go forward. Um, Let me see. There was some talk just this last week from the ambassador from China talking about a visit by Xi to Tokyo. You might remember that it was planned in 2019, just before COVID started. So there was all of the hotel rooms were reserved. The cars were being lined up, and then it was canceled as a consequence of COVID. So it's been quite a while. I think it's been since 2008 since there's been a state visit by a president from China. And so it's a long time coming. I think it's in the works. You've got to imagine that it's awful difficult for the president to, I mean, look at all the things that he's dealing with there now in Hong Kong, the protests that they're having there, his zero COVID policy, and a lot of protests, even protests here in Japan, claiming that, this is unfair to the people of China. It is not how a country should operate. People shouldn't be doing that to their own people. So he's getting a lot of heat there. It's difficult to imagine that he would have a state visit in relatively short period. He just met with the prime minister last week when he was in Indonesia. So there is some hope for that. I think that would be a really good thing. They didn't talk about a state visit when they met last week, apparently. But I think that's probably hot on the list of things that people would like to see. This issue between China and Taiwan is just reaching a fever pitch, and all of the world is watching that, and they're sending their navies over to practice with the Japanese. The 2+2 is as a consequence of that. You've got the Quad. So I think China is carefully weighing its options, and it might be time for a little bit of diplomacy to be exercised. And like the prime minister here in Japan, he's under a lot of heat. He goes overseas on an 8-day visit to bolster his image. It is a tried and true tactic, and it might be one that the president of China might be considering. So we'll continue to look at that and report that for you. Let me see, what else do we have? There's a lot going on with regard to the prime minister and his stability, his ability to stay as prime minister. So I teed up the beginning of this briefing with that theme, and then we've gone through a lot of the details, what he's confronting now. Now what I'd like to talk about is politically his chances of going into the next year as the prime minister. So there are a lot of things that are going in his favor. He is from Hiroshima. He wants to promote denuclearization. He wants to support the G7, which is visiting in the spring. They've already identified Hiroshima as the site for that. So it's a big deal for him. It's a big deal for Japan to host these nations. It would be really not so great if we changed prime ministers before we had that, because this was all set up by him. But still, politics being as it is, there are a lot of issues that are confronting him, and people even in his own party are thinking it might be time to change horses. He is in that danger zone in the 30s, in the high 20s, and no prime minister has survived long in that region. And he's looking for something to bolster that, to take him above that so that he can survive. That's one of the reasons why you see this defense spending and his, in the background, ingratiating himself to the Abe faction. So, making things that are important to them, achieving them for them. There's, always backroom horse trading that goes on there to secure himself, and also not just the defense spending, but the supplemental budget, securing his position with Komeito, his coalition party, and making people who are perhaps predisposed to not be thinking very kindly towards him to be thinking a little bit more kindly, because they got a supplemental budget, because they received money for food and shelter, or the gas prices aren't reaching through the roof. So there's a lot of that going on. I don't know if it's enough to carry him forward. There's a lot of political movement going on right now. The politics is beginning to shift, and when that happens, pieces of the puzzle begin to move. So if you're watching the movement of the opposition, not the opposition, but the LDP elders, Mr. Nikai, and the situation within the Abe faction, you're drawn to the supposition that it is time that somebody is going to change horses. One of the constant refrains that we hear this all the time, is that there's nobody to replace him. There's nobody capable to replace him. That's always said because in this country, in this culture, to assert yourself as a potential candidate is like shooting yourself in the foot. You would never say that. You just wait for the timing, and then by acclamation, people, ask you to be, the leader or the bucho or the leader of the group. So that's the way it kind of works here. He's spent most of his political capital in maintaining his position so far. With the diet in session now, and the fact that he needs to extend it to pass some of the bills, it's also not, it doesn't put him in great positive light. Then the diet will end, and you've got at least a month, probably a month and a half, until the Constitution dictates that the new diet session needs to start in January. There could be some shenanigans there, and I'm teeing this up for you now because I think that within the next couple of days, maybe 2 weeks, there'll be some things happening that really shake what's going on in Japanese politics. In fact, I'm having a presentation with Dan Harada. Let me see, that will be on December 15th. It will be a video conference at noon on a Thursday. So if you're interested in joining that, it will be a 1-hour briefing with Dan Harada, who is a real fixture in Japanese politics. He is a specialist on LDP politics. He's been doing this for as long as I've known him. I've known him for 35 years. And he does a political briefing once a month as well. He's very well known. Please stay tuned. If you're interested, check on my LinkedIn profile, and you can see where the details are for signing up for that. But I think you need to register for it, send in an application, and then the URL will be sent to you. Anyway, that is about it for today, Maya. I think I've gone a little bit long, especially on defense spending. But please stay tuned. Next week will be very active. That will be the end of the diet by the time we meet next week. So I think there's going to be a lot happening between now and then. And then the days after that until the end of the year are going to be very active in Japanese politics. So please stay tuned. Maya?
Yes, thank you, Timothy. That was another great briefing. So I am going to ask you to move once again to Clubhouse, and so we can continue the conversation there. I could hear the birds behind you or above you. That was a very nice sound, and the view is also nice. So,
well, the birds have increased the audience by about tenfold.
Right. Okay, so that is good to know too. Well, stay on board and please join Clubhouse as soon as we log out of
Okay,
the
thank
live
you.
stream.
I'll see you on the Clubhouse side.
Yes.
Thank you.